Shadow Hack. Chapter 561, Ancient Gods' Malicious Designs. Li Yunmu extended his hand to grab the cyan halo floating above the enemy's hand, and the azure dragon deity suit which had merged with his body instantly resonated with it. The piece was swiftly absorbed into the supreme battle suit, thus gathering all of its parts together. Li Yunmu followed Frontline God's departing figure with his eyes, but he didn't feel the slightest bit excited in his heart. Although receiving the final part of Azure Dragon Deity suit would make his strength take a large leap, the feeling of crisis in his heart had only increased. If he needed to only receive an attack from Frontline God to obtain the final piece of Azure Dragon Deity suit, what calamity did the will of heaven and earth indicate? It couldn't be that a mistake was made by the universe and it was actually just a huge opportunity for him and nothing more. After all, although his injury seemed ordinary, it would still take him more than 10 days of recuperation for his combat strength to reach its peak once more. A great calamity from which I will get a new lease on my life. What exactly is it? Li Yunmu turned to look in the direction of Frontline God with a dignified expression and saw the battle sage's silhouette stop. Soon after, a voice came from the body dressed in black, and in front of Li Yunmu's eyes, it exploded into pieces. In a moment, there was nothing but a fog of blood in the sky. Li Yunmu felt as if ice-cold water had been poured over him. He suddenly realized that he had fallen for a sinister scheme. Frontline God definitely wasn't a generous person, so the reason he had come to give him the final part should have been because of Battle Sage Vega and other top powerhouses. In other words, all the top powerhouses of his plane knew that Frontline God would come to find him on that day. And now they would learn that not only had Li Yunmu gathered all the parts of Azure Dragon Deity suit, but that one of the top powerhouses, Frontline God, had also perished after meeting him. He lost his life in Li Yunmu's territory and didn't even leave an intact corpse to be examined, making sure that not even his injuries could be checked for any kind of proof. With such evidence pointing at him, even if Li Yunmu jumped into the Yellow River, he still couldn't clear his name. The blame of Frontline God's death was tightly fastened to his head. Who was it? Who exactly was it? Li Yunmu mumbled to himself. Suddenly though, he bellowed, that surprisingly dares to plot against me. The instant Frontline God's body exploded and turned into a fog of blood, Li Yunmu knew the calamity from which he might only narrowly escape. At the critical juncture of deciding the fate of humanity, he surprisingly killed a high-level powerhouse for a treasure. Moreover, even if all his previous conduct was considered and Battle Sage Vega as well as Battle God took his side, it would still be impossible to mediate and calm the hostility of the top powerhouses. Not to mention that Battle Sage Vega and Battle God would never deliberately become enemies of the whole world just to protect Li Yunmu. From that instant, he would be considered as an enemy of humanity, and it was even possible that some top powerhouses would leave the attack on the 7th dimension to come and suppress the criminal rampaging in their own backyard. If Frontline God had truly died under his hands, it would still have been somewhat all right. But Li Yunmu hadn't received any notification from the system regarding his attack, so clearly, the other's death had no relation to him. Either don't start or don't stop. Using the opportunity of everyone being in the 7th dimension to break the foundation. Suddenly, a terrifying thought arose in Li Yunmu's mind. Ding! Spiritual attack from an unknown enemy detected. Requesting host to immediately issue the command for counterattack. Ding! Host is under the control of unknown spiritual attack. System selected to expel the attack. Ding! Using experience points to expel all experience points consumed. Expelling failed. Ding! Using ability points to expel all ability points consumed. Failed. Ding! Using space elements to expel all space elements consumed. Failed. Ding! Using Heavenly World's power to expel half of the Heavenly World's power consumed. Success. After the successive notifications from the system echoed in Li Yunmu's mind, he quickly regained clarity. His body was covered in sweat from head to toe, and without any hesitation, he quickly checked his profile to investigate whether the attack moments before had been real or his imagination. System, 7th level. Host, Lee Yun Mu. Shadows, 18. Experience points, 0. Ability points, 0. Space elements, 0. Comprehension points, 0. Heavenly World, 2 Sun, weak. Foundation skill, Arrow Evasion, Great Heights, Violent Blade Critical Leap Strike, Reaching Perfection, 9 Shadow Heavenly Insect Step, Small Success, Tyrannical Cross-Shaped Arms, Extraordinary Sage, Flash Step, Integration, Thunderous Pressure Kick, Excellence, Blind Shot, Integration, 3-part Origin Arrow, Small Success, Shadow Carapace, Integration, Disaster Punch, Small Success, Heavenly Blade, Small Success, Unique Shadow Heavenly Blade Chop, Small Success, Thunder Fiend. Soul Hunting Arrow, Integration. Cultivation Methods, Aurora Killing Justice, Chow Tien 8 Steps, Great Sun Secret Technique, Wind God Tornado Kick, Spirit Pincer Step, Spirit Pincer Rip, Ghostly Evasion, Ghostly Image Substitution, Ghost King Body Refining Secrets, Ghost King's Body Refining Secrets, Ghost Inheritance, Plant Essence Innate Healing Reversal. Body Refining, Admiralty Cover, Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets, Cross Cover Armor, Great Sun Thunder Tyrant Body Muscle Marrow Secrets. Special Cultivation Methods, Meridian Nurturing Flux Point Technique, Infant Soul Preservation. Desperate Fatal Move, Danger Critical Extinguisher. Lee Yun Mu knitted his brows and asked with a gloomy face, System, just now that unknown attack which affected my mental consciousness, what was it? Experience points, ability points, space elements, and comprehension points had all been used up to the last one. After all, there hadn't many of them after his breakthrough. The overall effect wasn't too great, and so his heavenly world's power had been used up. His heavenly world fell into a weak state, with no hope of being utilized anytime soon. Ding! System is investigating. Investigation finished. System discovered remnants of God Undercurrent's power in host's body. Do you wish to expel it? Once the system's notification appeared in Lee Yun Mu's mind, sweat ran down his back once more. He hadn't expected that the person who tried to ambush him after scheming against him was surprisingly God Undercurrent. If Lee Yun Mu wasn't in possession of Super Shadow Hack System, he probably would have been reduced to Barbarian Niu and Ling Shuang's state. Even if God Undercurrent couldn't seize his body for the time being, he still would have been under his complete control. Good, good, good. Lee Yun Mu began to laugh in cold fury. This father of yours did not go provoke you, only hoping to use your pressure to make the human powerhouses view him as important. Yet you came to provoke him. Do you really believe that this father of yours is a pushover and won't do anything regardless of what you do? Chapter 562, Leaving for the Seventh Dimension. Humph. You don't know how to appreciate someone's kindness. A voice filled with anger echoed in the area, and shortly after, a tall and sturdy figure slowly cleaved space somewhere in the wilderness. Although his body was shrouded in a faint layer of mist, the presence rising from his body was extremely terrifying. It seemed strong enough to destroy the heavens and shatter the earth. The tall and sturdy silhouette, which stood in the seventh dimension, wouldn't need to announce its name no matter where it went. If the man appeared in front of any top powerhouses, the opponent would immediately yell out his name, God Undercurrent. He stepped forward and ordered the person following behind him in a loud and clear voice, "Pass on my instructions to our people hiding in the human army's camp. They are to spread the information that Lee Yun Mu didn't agree to cooperate with all the powers and even killed frontline God to snatch the part of Supreme Battlesuit. Make sure that they know that within the next few days, he is planning to launch attacks on all the other powers of Earth as well." What sort of existence was God Undercurrent? Whether it was Battle Sage Vega, Battle God, Sword Sage, or any other top powerhouse, all these experts standing at the peak couldn't even be counted as a fart in front of the ancient god who had stood at the pinnacle in the old days. Yet it was difficult for God Undercurrent to restore his strength to the peak with the body which he had seized. Although he had unified the entire seventh dimension, he still didn't want to start an all-out war with the forces of Earth for the time being. His original idea was the same as that of Lee Yun-mu, to use the imminent heavenly transformation for his gain. But he hadn't expected that just after he barely unified the seventh dimension and was yet to make his move toward the opponent, the top powerhouses of Earth would form a grand alliance and even put aside their past grudges to deal with him. Strength. Without the support of absolute strength, a person didn't have the right to speak in this world. Barbarian Niu's physical body could be considered as pretty good, but compared to Lee Yun-mu's stunning ultra-powerful body, it was greatly inferior. Therefore, God Undercurrent had personally infiltrated Earth to see if he could find a way to seize Lee Yun-mu's flesh or not. Even if he couldn't attach his soul to it but managed to subdue it like he had done with Ling Xuang, he would gain another trump card in his arsenal. I wonder what sort of unknown method that youngster used to completely dispel my divine power. Coldness flickered in God Undercurrent's eyes, and he took a few deep breaths before continuing to speak in the same cold tone. It doesn't matter. Since I cannot obtain it, I can only destroy it. He was well aware that if he ignored Lee Yun-mu's growth, then in the future, the threat he posed to him would definitely not be any weaker than that of Battle God or Battle Sage Vega. System, since you were able to expel the divine power with which God Undercurrent tried to seize my body, can you do the same when we encounter Ling Xuang and Barbarian Niu? Lee Yun-mu rushed through the sky, his figure flickering continuously. He fully unleashed Flash Step, not daring to slow down in the slightest. Since everything had been a conspiracy by God Undercurrent to control him, the next step was an obvious one. The god would throw all kinds of filth on Lee Yun-mu and turn him into a criminal of the entire humanity, without leaving him any margin to turn it around. In other words, if Lee Yun-mu didn't do anything and continued to remain on Earth, waiting for the top human powerhouses to join hands and deal with him, then not only would he himself, but even his friends and family would be implicated in his matter. Therefore, Lee Yun-mu has to hurry to the seventh dimension and make it completely clear that he stood on humanity's side. Expelling God Undercurrent's divine power isn't difficult. Theoretically speaking, if you wanted to remove his control from Ling Xuang and Barbarian Niu, then as long as you had sufficient experience points, it could be done, the system calmly replied. However, its response caused Lee Yun-mu's heart to sink all of a sudden. When God Undercurrent had tried to subdue him, the system had autonomously used up all of his accumulated points. He was even forced to use his heavenly world's power, and the second son of his heavenly world was in an extremely chaotic state. If he forcefully used the heavenly world's power once more, it was likely that the heavenly world's grade would fall. The system had only named experience points, so it was likely that the other types of points were basically useless in expelling God Undercurrent's divine energy. After some thinking, he had a strong hunch that the amount of experience points required to free either of the people would be an astronomical one. Host can decide his matters by himself, the system won't interfere much. However, from the analyzed data, if Host used experience points to create more shadows to increase his strength, they would provide far more advantages than followers like Barbarian Niu or Ling Xuang. Hey! Lee Yun-mu grinned, revealing his canines. He had already reached a decision in his heart though. Although the assistance of a few more shadows would indeed be enormous for him, he wasn't the type to do nothing when something bad happened to his followers and friends like Barbarian Niu and Ling Xuang. When the calamity descended in the future, would he face it alone? From that moment on, did he only want himself and his shadows in the world? He lightly flicked his wrist, and Void Disk suddenly appeared. The surrounding space was instantly became like a lake above which gusts of wind were passing. Surprisingly, ripples visible to the naked eye appeared in space. Lee Yun-mu narrowed his eyes and suddenly shouted, "Open for me." Following Lee Yun-mu's words, large fluctuations appeared in the ripples in space, and slowly the space was pulled apart to form a tunnel large enough for a single adult to pass. Lee Yun-mu was completely clear that by then, he might have already been branded as the criminal of humanity. If he used the established methods to enter the seventh dimension, he would probably be captured by the top powerhouses before he even knew what was happening. Battle God, Sword Sage, Blade Sage, and Battle Sage Vega were all far more formidable than Frontline God, while his strength was barely sufficient to endure the might of Frontline God's one punch. Even if he had gathered all of Azure Dragon Deity Suit, Li Yunyu still couldn't mirror the strength of those ultra powerhouses. Fortunately, he had the Supreme Void Disc in his hands, which had a useful function. When it was added to his current strength, it wasn't a difficult task for him to open a passage connecting to the other dimensions. I wonder what's the situation on that side. What stage has the invasion of the allied armies reached? Li Yunyu pondered in his heart. His greatest hope was that the allied forces would be stuck in some difficult region, so he could investigate and find some solution to their problem. If he could help humanity to break the stalemate, then even if some people wanted to use the death of Frontline God to implicate him, it wouldn't be easy. Chapter 563, Grievous News. Frontline God had died in battle. The Azure Dragon Deity Suit's part was snatched. Li Yunyu was about to launch an attack on everyone. One after another, 3 pieces of important news crushed the morale of Earth's allied forces. Even Battle God, who was previously of the opinion of roping in Li Yunyu, was trembling with anger at that moment. If not for the complicated situation forcing him to remain in the 7th dimension, he would have personally returned to Earth to tear Li Yunyu to shreds. I could sense from the start that the young wretch didn't have good intentions. Once his strength increased, he immediately fell out with us and became hostile. If I may suggest, we should put aside the battle in the 7th dimension for the time being. In any case, both sides are relatively peaceful right now. Stop the battle, then what? Do you plan to return to Earth and personally deal with Li Yunyu? Old monk, what do you mean by these words? How can we deal with outside aggression before settling internal strifes? The threat of Li Yunyu attacking our foundations is much bigger than that Ling Shuang occupying the 7th dimension. Aren't you just using this as an excuse to leave the battlefield? When talking about dealing with Li Yunyu, let's first put aside the question of whether you've the guts to even attempt it and talk about whether you've the strength to accomplish it. Even Frontline God wasn't an opponent for that youngster. And not only was he killed, he even lost the Azure Dragon Deity Suit piece. What about you? You're but a fart in comparison. Listening to the bickering powerhouses, Battle Sage Vega felt her headache grow. How did these people even remotely resemble the top powerhouses of humanity? They were just like street vendors and hawkers fighting for their businesses. Any clear-headed person could see that the matter of Li Yunyu killing Frontline God to snatch the Azure Dragon Deity Suit part was a little fishy. There was also the question of disparity in strength of the two sides. Even if Li Yunyu's strength had made a breakthrough, it still couldn't have increased to the extent that Frontline God would have been unable to flee or call for help. Moreover, Li Yunyu wasn't a moron. The piece of Azure Dragon Deity Suit had been brought to him, so it hadn't been necessary for him to seize it by force. He should have known that if Frontline God died under his hands, then the other top powerhouses which had past grudges with him would definitely create trouble. Actually, Battle Sage Vega was completely clear about one matter in her heart. If the top powerhouses returned to Earth and left the battlefield in the name of taking care of Li Yunyu, then the next time, they wouldn't be to enter the 7th dimension with ease. After all, the power of the factions under these top powerhouses had declined greatly. Even if Battle Sage Vega was one of the supreme experts of humanity and had guarded the central continent for several years, her authority wasn't much when confronted with the numerous top powerhouses. It was weak to the point that it was basically impossible for her to go against the general opinion and shield Li Yunyu. Battle Sage, who was standing near her, looked at her and shrugged, implying that as much as he wanted to help, he could not. Since the matter had reached such a point, he was also forced to make a decision. Regardless of whether the top powerhouses could see through the affair or not, the general consensus of retreating had formed among them. If the Earth's allied forces retreated from the 7th dimension, then the person who would benefit the most would undoubtedly be God Undercurrent and not Li Yunyu, who had snatched a part of Azure Dragon Deity Suit. A middle-aged man clad in pitch-black clothes and emitting sinister presence stepped forth from his people and said in a profound voice, "Sire Battle God and Lord Battle Sages, I myself am also inclined toward retreating back to Earth. However, this time's matter is clearly a plot by God Undercurrent. Naturally, I also don't rule out the possibility that Li Yunmu sees us as a strong opponent that's stuck with God Undercurrent, so he went against the wind." After speaking this much, the middle-aged man slightly raised the corners of his mouth and coldly sneered. "I propose for Sire Battle God to capture Li Yunmu so we could interrogate him and wouldn't be so anxious to return to Earth. If he is truly being treated unjustly, then that would also be great. By relying on his tyrannical strength, we would definitely be able to make a breakthrough in this battle." The middle-aged man had another name, Crow Sage, and he also cultivated secondary flux energy. His strength wasn't greater than that bestial sage who had perished previously. However, Crow Sage could summon underworld ravens, which were the same type of creatures as summoned by the bow previously used by Li Yunmu. Moreover, he could summon a terrifying amount of them with his present strength. Therefore, many people who were more formidable than him were still unwilling to provoke him. Now, although Crow Sage's words seemed to be currying favor, the terrifying killing intent in his words caused even Battle God to feel cold. If Li Yunmu was truly brought to this camp, who could ensure his safety with so many top powerhouses ready to attack him? He could sacrifice Li Yunmu to maintain the offense in the 7th dimension, or withdraw and see the top powerhouses join hands to deal with Li Yunmu. A multiple-choice answer with identical results appeared in front of Battle Sage Vega and Battle God. The experts of the remaining 3 transcending powers didn't express any attitude on this matter, clearly giving the authority to Battle God. He lightly licked his lips and fixed his gaze on Crow Sage for a long while before calmly replying, "All right, I will send people to search for Li Yunmu. But before he is captured and brought here, everyone must continue to maintain the offensive. Let me know if someone is secretly creating trouble." An expert which could attain the status of Battle God wasn't simply a fortunate or courageous existence. Back in the day, Battle Sage Vega had personally gone to kill Bestial Sage in order to obtain the Azure Dragon Pearl for Li Yunmu to nurture him. Yet when Battle God needed the top powerhouses to continue the offensive in the 7th dimension, what did one Li Yunmu count as? Even if he was really being accused wrongly, Battle God wouldn't hesitate in killing him if one death could stabilize the morality of the military camp and assist in bringing the humanity together to face the great calamity waiting for them in the near future. Crow Sage faintly smiled and said, "Since your distinguished self Battle Sage has opened his mouth, we will naturally do as you bid us." With a few words, the death of a person was fixed. All the powerhouses including Crow Sage were clever people. They clearly knew that Battle Sage Vega and some others wouldn't let them easily return to Earth, so they chose a roundabout way to trap and kill Li Yunmu. Even in the worst-case scenario, they could still gain a little benefit by reducing the number of casualties in the 7th dimension to a minimum. Yet even if Battle God and the others knew about Crow Sage's scheme, they didn't expose him but rather supported him directly. In fact, Battle God and other supreme experts didn't even hold any malice toward him, since his suggestion would stabilize the Allied army. Chapter 564, Breaking Through an Impregnable Pass. At that time, Li Yunmu, who had just entered the 7th dimension, was standing on a mountain peak not far from the Earth's Allied force. He was observing the Impregnable Pass, which was barring the way for the humans. That unnamed pass was a rush job created by God Undercurrent before the attack of Earth's forces. When Li Yunmu looked at the Impregnable Pass, he sighed inwardly. God Undercurrent was certainly not an ordinary character. Even materials chosen to construct the obstacle were all able to suppress the flux energy inside fluxers. What an ordinary Nirvana Flux Master could unleash in the pass would definitely not surpass the level of a transcending Flux Master. Although it might appear that the materials would suppress the strength of both attackers and the defenders, this wasn't the case. After all, the defending side still had weapons that could be used. If the Allied forces of Earth wanted to attack, they would definitely have to pay an enormous price. The remaining people would then have to kill their way into the city with great difficulty, where enemy cultivators would be waiting at their peak strength. Because of the Impregnable Pass existence, the Allied forces of Earth were forced to halt. As long as they couldn't break through, even facing off against the people of God undercurrent was impossible. Ordinary Fluxers are more or less useless under the suppression. Only a powerful expert with a tyrannical body could resist the first few waves of enemy attacks and forcibly kill their way into the city, thus opening the path for the Fluxers who were physically weak. In one glance, Li Yunmyu clearly understood the conditions needed to break through the Impregnable Pass. Also, after seeing the Impregnable Pass, he realized why Frontline God had come to give the part of Azure Dragon deity suit. After all, it was impossible that the 6 transcending powers couldn't see the conditions required to break through the pass. Previously, many Fluxers and evolved humans, who thought that they possessed tyrannical physical body, should have tried to break through, but failed to make any real progress. Naturally, if the powerhouses of the transcending powers took the lead of a unit of Fluxers, then breaking through the pass would not be too difficult. But even a supreme expert like Battle God would find his strength suppressed when passing through. And the enemy had God Undercurrent, a being with unfathomable strength bringing up their rear. In case the 6 transcending powers separated and found their strength suppressed, who would stand before God Undercurrent? This Impregnable Pass is not something I cannot break. Li Yunmyu slightly narrowed his eyes, and a smile appeared on his face. Given the strength of his body, apart from Frontline God, he hadn't seen any Fluxer who could compare with him in terms of physical power. With the addition of the reinforcement provided by the complete Azure Dragon deity suit, he was confident that he wouldn't be at the slightest disadvantage if he faced off against Frontline God once more. And if God Undercurrent attacked? Would the powerhouses of Earth's 5 transcending powers keep watching like spectators? When thinking about this, a small smile played on Li Yunmyu's face. His body quickly flew up, transforming into a long energy dragon that rushed toward the Earth's army camp. Attack! The guards standing outside the Allied army camp weren't idiots. They knew that all the powerhouses on their side were in the camp, so the moment they saw the terrifying dragon rushing toward them, they knew what it had come to do. In an instant, the protective spell formation was unleashed. A layer of faint cyan light film enveloped the entire Allied camp. Even a first-rate powerhouse like Crow Sage would require close to 10 breaths to break such a formation. And the 10 breaths were more than enough for the supreme experts of the 5 transcending powers to frighten the Crow Sage out of his mind. Blade, appear! Li Yunmyu suddenly shouted, and Little Qing instantly came out of his heavenly world. Under the incredulous gazes of Earth's allied forces, it transformed into a 4 feet long broadsword. The next instant, Li Yunmyu used violent blade heavy leap chop and ruthlessly struck the cryon film. Thud! Along with a world-shaking echo, the warriors of the Allied forces camp experienced the feeling of the whole universe shaking. The layer of cryon film shook softly, and shortly after, Li Yunmyu's figure flew away. The warriors of Allied forces took a deep sigh of relief. All of them were scared that the senior of unknown origins would slice through the protective shield in one strike. It has to be known, thought, that only Battle Sage level powerhouses could accomplish such a thing. If a powerful Battle Sage appeared among the group of ordinary Fluxers before the 5 transcending powers managed to rush over, what sort of slaughter would happen? They were even afraid to think about it. Li Yunmyu, who was blown away, fell heavily on the ground and spit out a mouthful of dirt. His body had suffered no injury, after all, given the tenaciousness of his flesh. This degree of counter-attack was no better than tickling him. A moment later, he spat out 2 more mouthfuls of dust and crushed rocks and quickly stood up with a jump. With a faint smile, he said, "It seems like I have greatly underestimated the thirst of the Allied forces to stay alive. Even a protective spell formation is so durable and strong." Before his words were even finished, the Azure Dragon expert armor filled with azure flames covered his body. Once he had gathered all the pieces, his strength had greatly increased compared to before. With the battle armor filled with unique runes and azure flames covering his figure as well as his tall and sturdy body, Li Yunmu looked like a war god from ancient legends. Come again. Li Yunmu grinned after equipping Azure Dragon Expert Armor, and the cyan broadsword which was Little Ching rotated in his hand like it was weightless. However, the warriors of Earth's allied army clearly understood how formidable it was since it could shake the protective spell. Although Frontline God had injured Li Yunmu with his one punch before, things were no longer the same. After recovering, the power which Li Yunmu could use surpassed 1,700 oxen. With the addition of the complete Azure Dragon deity suit, even without any overestimation, it would easily reach 5,000 oxen. This was a power which could only be used by a battle sage level powerhouse. Wasn't it a little bit terrifying? He heavily stamped with his right foot, and his figure transformed into a cyan light, pouncing toward the protective spell of Earth's allied army camp once more. The energy fluctuations coming from his body alone were enough to destabilize the space of the seventh dimension. Chapter 565, Sword Draw vs Heavenly Blade. Oh! After sensing a human attack, Battle God, who had walked out of his camp, narrowed his eyes. His senses passed through countless army tents, locking on the azure figure rushing toward the camp, and he felt his breathing stop. Even if Frontline God hadn't died at Li Yunmu's hand, it was obvious that they had traded blows. Battle God didn't doubt it in the least. Given his understanding of the Sly Fox God undercurrent, he had definitely killed Frontline God after the traces of Li Yunmu's energy had entered his body. Since Frontline God had traded blows with Li Yunmu, the young man's condition at that moment was quite wrong. Even if he possessed tyrannical physical body and didn't need to recuperate for a year and a half like ordinary fluxers, he would definitely need some time to rest, right? However, given Li Yunmu's present state, he didn't seem to be injured in the least. Outside the camp, Li Yunmu sensed that someone had locked onto him, but he didn't find that unexpected. After all, the supreme powerhouses of the five transcending powers were all present in the allied army camp. At that moment, Li Yunmu had only one thought: first cut apart this tortoise shell and then think of other things. One attack couldn't shatter the protective spell formation and had even counterattacked him with enough power to blow him away. From the time he began cultivating, he hadn't eaten such a loss. If he couldn't shatter this tortoise shell for that, he would have no excuse for himself. Open formation, I will go to him. With one step, Battle God reached the edge of the allied camp, and his resonant voice echoed through it. The next instant, Battle God swept past the tents and rushed straight at Li Yunmu. His imposing manner did not lose to that of Li Yunmu, even slightly suppressing him. Sword Draw! Heavenly Blade! Two loud shouts echoed at the same time when Li Yunmu saw a silhouette rushing toward him. The opponent's speed was extremely fast, which preventing him from seeing their face clearly. He could sense, however, that the opponent wasn't weak. If he dared to meet his attack head-on, how could he be considered weak? Li Yunmu didn't have the option of using an ordinary strike anymore and was forced to use his most formidable blade skill. At the same time, Admiralty War's dragon in his body roared and attached itself to the heavenly blade's cyan blade intent, making its might extraordinary. Although Li Yunmu had observed the heavenly blade in his mind and practiced it several times, he had no idea that its full-powered strike could resonate with Admiralty War's dragon. With the two skills combining, his might rose to next level. Battle God might have been empty-handed, but in his realm, apart from supreme treasures like the Azure Dragon deity suit, other ordinary equipment was completely useless of him. Moreover, he didn't want to kill Li Yunmu but to confirm one thing: whether Li Yunmu could resist a strike from a supreme powerhouse. Sword Draw was the most basic type of blade skill. According to legend, when it was cultivated to the peak, just unsheathing the blade would release a power equivalent to the power used by Pangu to cleave apart heaven and earth. Li Yunmu had never seen it before, but unfortunately for Battle God, he used it against a blade skill which had reached excellence. When the blade energy produced empty-handed collided with the blade energy of the heavenly blade with a golden dragon tangled around it, the dispersed energy actually spread over 1,000 kilometers area after the collision. Even the color of the cyan energy film protecting the allied camp lightened several times. It actually wasn't far from collapsing completely. Powerful. Li Yunmyu became inwardly apprehensive. Admiralty War's dragon mainly focused on defense, but when combined with the Heavenly Blade's blade energy, it would even be able to force Frontline God to retreat. After all, he would not be able to break this blade energy and have to rely on his flesh and treasures to resist it. But the senior who met his attack directly surprisingly shattered his golden dragon heavenly blade attack empty-handed by just motioning the moves of pulling out a blade. What sort of terrifying existence was this? Haha! Battle God smiled faintly and raised his head in high spirits. Li Yunmyu, seems like we have greatly underestimated you. With a seriously injured body, you used a strike which could threaten even me. Seems like Frontline God's defeat at your hands wasn't due to a fluke. Even if there was a smile on Battle God's face, Li Yunmyu could clearly sense the killing intent flowing like water from him. The strike which he had accidentally learned had surprisingly even caused the famed Battle God to feel threatened. What did this imply? It clearly implied that there was a possibility of Frontline God dying at his hands. Moreover, when Li Yunmyu heard Battle God's words, he clearly understood that the news of Frontline God perishing had already spread to the 7th dimension. He sent Little Qing back into his world, and his Azure Dragon expert armor also gradually dissipated. Although the collision with Battle God didn't result in Li Yunmyu's complete loss, his complexion paled greatly. When a formidable fluxer who possessed vigorous energy had the color drain from his face, it could only mean one thing: Li Yunmyu's injuries had become far worse after Battle God's strike. When confronted with Battle God's gaze which was full of killing intent, Li Yunmyu could only shake his head lightly and calmly say, "Frontline God and I indeed traded a blow, but he heavily injured me in one strike, so a life and death battle was out of question. Frontline God's death is God Undercurrent's doing. You saying that doesn't make it true." Battle God lifted up his chin and arrogantly said, "I only know that Frontline God went to deliver a part of the Azure Dragon deity suit to you and that the power you displayed just now could indeed threaten a battle sage. Whether you believe or not, that's up to you," Li Yunmyu said coldly while shrugging. "I didn't come to the 7th dimension to prove anything. My only goal is to retaliate against God Undercurrent. If you want to block my path, then I cannot do anything but..." After speaking up to this point, Li Yunmyu suddenly raised his voice, "Everyone should have seen my strength and potential. If you want to attack me, best have complete certainty in being able to kill me, otherwise, regardless of who it is or what sort of power they have behind them, I will make them pay the price." Arrogant. This word rose in heart of every powerhouse who witnessed the exchange between Battle God and Li Yunmyu. Yet he could even compete with Battle God on even equal terms, so why wouldn't he be arrogant? Chapter 566, Those who walk barefoot don't fear people wearing shoes. When confronted with the group of completely silent powerhouses, Li Yunmyu only sneered. At the time he had just started on his path of cultivation, the number of top powerhouses and sects under them whose malicious intentions he had resisted weren't few in number. Now though, after spectating the confrontation between him and Battle God, none of them dared to step forward. All of their expressions held anger. Although there were also people with whom Li Yunmyu had good relations, they were so few of them it would raise people's hackles. Among the gathered top powerhouses, Crow Sage had the ugliest expression. It wasn't long ago that he had set a trap to kill Li Yunmyu. Although other powerhouses weren't so senseless as to go and say something about him, it was highly possible that some of the clever ones or those who intended to form good relations with Li Yunmyu would go and deliberately babble. "You are Li Yunmyu? You certainly are powerful." Crow Sage grinned and raised his tone to address everyone. "Originally, we thought that by relying on your strength, you had no way to kill Frontline God in a battle, but now, since he had already offended Li Yunmyu, he might as well offend him to death. Crow Sage thus found the perfect time when all the top powerhouses were gathered to land the first strike against Lee Yun-mu. Although the battle moments ago had been brief, the majority of powerhouses had clearly seen Battle Sage not using his full strength when he unleashed sword draw. He hadn't even used a weapon, but Crow Sage still seized the moment. Then, as long as Battle God confirmed that Lee Yun-mu killed Frontline God, then even if the youth had 3 heads and 6 hands, he couldn't overturn the rising tide. Surprisingly though, none of the top powerhouses opened their mouth to agree with Crow Sage. It has to be known that although Battle God hadn't used his full strength, hadn't Lee Yun-mu come with a heavily injured body? If by any chance the youth survived the day, could they still hope for him to let them off in the future? Furthermore, Battle God was a proud and arrogant person. Such an existence viewed raising his hand against a person lower than him as a disgrace. Besides, Lee Yun-mu was seriously injured, so the possibility of Battle God attacking him was next to impossible, unless... I see, you probably have already relied on God Undercurrent for help, right? Can it be assumed then that after plotting to murder Frontline God, you've now come to attack us? You say that you stand on our side, but when you returned to Earth, why didn't you establish contact with us straight away? Instead, you went on a rampage against Fluxers in Lucky Wind City and acted like a hegemon on Earth. Seeing that people hadn't agreed with him, Crow Sage almost gnashed his teeth, but on the outside, he maintained his calm. He showed neither sorrow nor happiness while launching another blow against Lee Yun-mu. Battle God wouldn't attack someone who was weaker than him, let alone someone seriously injured, even if that person had the strength to battle him. Crow Sage was well aware of this, so after his first strike failed, he opened his mouth once more and attempted to push Lee Yun-mu toward God Undercurrent's side. If he was turned into an enemy of the entire humanity, Battle God would not remain still. He wasn't someone who was completely inflexible with his ideals. What, you want to kill me? Lee Yun-mu slightly narrowed his eyes, a dangerous coldness flickering in them. Originally, he hadn't planned to make such a bombasting entrance, like his previous exchange with Battle God. He hadn't even recognized that the person welcoming him was surprisingly the most powerful person under the deity realm on Earth. According to his original plan, he was only supposed to check out the people and the defensive weapons deployed before the Impregnable pass. But all sorts of coincidences had already pushed him to the stage, so Lee Yun-mu might as well do away with all politeness. After all, none of the top powerhouses was an amiable character, and since they were already full of malice toward him, this wouldn't change even in the future. If he didn't do anything, he would have to blindly submit to humiliation and once more become chess piece in their hands, waiting to be discarded once they extracted all worth from him. Lee Yun-mu, you are truly arrogant. Crow Sage furiously criticized him without thinking anything. He didn't believe that Lee Yun-mu could continuously use the previous strike which had stunned even Battle God. Besides, he was currently seriously injured, so it was impossible for him to display his full strength. Thud. Lee Yun-mu took a step, and it seemed as if the entire heaven and earth shook. The terrifying physical strength began to flow out of his body, ready to erupt at any moment. Halt! Battle God who had been silent suddenly opened his mouth to berate them. Instantly, the terrifying aura congealed by Lee Yun-mu dispersed like clouds after a mad squall. Even his heart, which was filled with killing intent, gradually cooled down. Lee Yun-mu was completely clear in his heart that although Crow Sage harbored malicious intentions toward him, his words weren't wrong. He had indeed acted arrogantly. This was the main camp of the allied forces of the entire humanity where all the top experts had gathered. Even Crow Sage, who could only be considered among second or third tier Fluxers and whom Lee Yun-mu didn't place in his eyes, was an extremely powerful existence. After scattering Lee Yun-mu's killing intent with a shout, Battle God turned his head and gave an indifferent look to Crow Sage. Whether for good or bad, you are a senior expert, so you should treat others with the same courtesy. Do you think that apart from you, everyone here is an idiot? You were trying to use someone else's knife to kill him, but don't you think you tried to use the wrong person's knife? Upon hearing such words, Crow Sage lowered his head in shame. His both cheeks burned hotly, and even a hint of lingering fear took root in his heart. His desire to see Li Yunmu lose was so intense that he had even lost his reason. He had surprisingly dared to use the master of a transcending power as his tool, attempted to exploit Battle Sage's power to kill Li Yunmu. After reprimanding Crow Sage, Battle God slowly turned his head back and focused his gaze on Li Yunmu before coldly saying, "I still don't believe you, so I hope that you can provide an explanation for your actions after returning to Earth. Otherwise, or else there will be a price to pay, right?" Li Yunmu slightly squinted his eyes like a cat enjoying the sunshine. He had the confidence to say this line because, given his physical strength, even if the masters of the 5 transcending powers attacked him together, it would not be enough. They could seriously injure him, but it was impossible for them to instantly kill him. The small amount of time would be enough for him to make his escape. There was no place in the world where Li Yunmu couldn't go with the void disk in his hands. He could only be stopped if a deity personally took action and absorbed him into their world before he could respond. Chapter 567, The Prologue of the Battle. Do whatever you're good at, but don't interfere with my movements. After coldly leaving this line, Li Yunmu began to advance toward the Impregnable Pass step by step. Each of them easily covered more than 10 feet. After Li Yunmu was some distance away, Crow Sage swallowed his saliva and said with a lowered head, "Your Grace Battle God, this youngster is really rather arrogant. Even if your distinguished self has a forgiving heart and cannot bear to kill him directly, shouldn't you have taught him a lesson whatever his reasons?" Battle God didn't pay attention to Crow Sage's words and instructed in a loud voice, "Everyone, make your preparations. After 20 minutes, we will launch a full-on attack on the Impregnable Pass. We have been stopped here for too long, so this time, we must definitely capture it." With a person like Li Yunmu who had an extremely domineering body leading the charge, Earth's allied forces didn't need to be concerned about the annoying defensive weapons. As long as they could break through the Impregnable Pass, holding it down wouldn't be a difficult matter. After Li Yunmu shook off Earth's allied forces, he couldn't get rid of his disgust for them. They kept repeating words like "for the benefit of humanity," but in their heart, they didn't understand what was important and what was not. Just a bit of profit in front of their eyes would make them forget everything. Who knew how they had cultivated this far? System, if I forcibly break through this Impregnable Pass, how large is the possibility that I will perish here? Based on the analysis, if host is determined to break through by himself, then the possibility of perishing is 37%. Close to 40% chance of dying caused Li Yunmu's heart to clench, however, he still hardened his resolve. According to his estimation, of the total 37%, close to 30% were because of God Undercurrent's residence being close to the Impregnable Pass. Otherwise, there was no way that Earth's allied forces would have been held up for so long. Even the leaders of the 6 transcending powers had been unable to break through. This clearly revealed that just behind the checkpoint, there was an existence which struck fear even in the hearts of the leaders of the 6 transcending powers. In the meantime, God Undercurrent, who was the cause of the apprehension in the heart of Earth's allied forces, was standing atop the walls of the Impregnable Pass, coldly watching the slender silhouette coming closer step by step. Should I say that you are too bold? Or should I say that you are too stupid? Even the top experts of the 6 transcending powers had been staying obediently at this pass without daring to move forward, but you want to break through on your own. Before God Undercurrent finished speaking, his attention was caught by a silhouette emitting terrifying presence in the allied army's camp. Battle God, who was armed to the teeth, had risen in the air, and behind him were the top human powerhouses. All of them were fully armed and filled with a terrifying killing intent, which could cause anyone's heart to palpitate. Even a formidable expert at the level of God Undercurrent couldn't help but feel his heart tighten at such a sight. Inform everyone to immediately go to the pass. They seem to have gone crazy all at once. We must hold this pass even if more than half of us fall. God Undercurrent's gaze fell on Ling Shuang's body when he gave her the command while appearing to be completely calm. The controlled woman nodded and transformed into a ray of light that swept toward the resting area in the Impregnable Pass. After a few breaths, more than 10 rays of lights rushed in different directions. At the Allied Army's camp, Battle Sage Vega was watching the rays of light rushing in different directions. With the slightest change on her cold face, she commanded in a voice much more serious than before, "Ask for the help of soldiers, scouts, lone wolves, and ambushers in the vicinity of the camp. I don't need for all of them to stay, but at least half of them must." 10 of the senior Fluxers affiliated with Vega Temple quickly left the tent, which was the core of the army. If Battle God was the sharpest knife of the Allied army, then Battle Sage Vega was the brain who controlled the entire situation. Whether it was due to her strength or intelligence, she was fully qualified to occupy this position. The many years she had spent defending the central continent hadn't gone to waste. But with her strength and position, there were many things which she couldn't accomplish. In fact, rather than saying she couldn't, it would be better to say she didn't dare. For example, she didn't dare to adopt Li Yunmu's attitude of facing 10 million men on her own or turning all of the top powerhouses into her enemy without any hesitation. She couldn't ruthlessly retaliate against God Undercurrent either. That sort of domineering attitude, how many people in a generation could display it? With Li Yunmu's interference, the prologue to the final battle which Battle Sage Vega and Battle God had awaited for a long time finally began. The hearts of the top powerhouses had almost collapsed. Previously, they had tried to turn Li Yunmu into a criminal against the whole humanity just so they could return to Earth and protect their forces. They had acted as if as long as he died, all the problems which humanity faced would be solved. But no one had expected that this criminal of humanity would surprisingly dare to come to the 7th dimension and pick a fight with God Undercurrent, rushing off straight toward the Impregnable Pass which had been obstructing the army's advance for a long time. When the criminal attacked, all the top powerhouses who kept babbling that everything was for the benefit of humanity watched foolishly from the back. There was little doubt that their names would be muddled when they returned to Earth. Before the Dark Ages, there was a saying, that there was no free lunch in the world. It was impossible for them to not pay the price for their actions. The powerhouses behind Battle God and Sword Sage were like people strolling around in a park. With each step of Battle God, God Undercurrent felt the gaze upon him burn even hotter. He was standing above the Impregnable Pass, thinking about how his strength had greatly improved. Yet it was still restricted at frontline God's level. Under the pressure, it might raise up a bit more, but it would be only a minor improvement. The enemy, however, had 5 people. The difficulty of the battle rose vertically in a straight line, especially since Earth's allied forces had an existence called Li Yunmu. It could be said that the battle's outcome was already set in stone, and it proclaimed human victory. I'm being forced to eat S.H.A.D.W here. Why did I go provoke this troublesome youngster? God Undercurrent secretly blamed his own decision in his heart. Who had known about Li Yunmu's temperament of not being afraid of the consequences? As long as someone provoked him, he would take his revenge sooner or later. However, God Undercurrent was clear that if he hadn't spread the information, Li Yunmu wouldn't have come in contact with him so early. Chapter 568, The Suppression on the Wall. Li Yunmu slowly came to the Impregnable Pass while gazing at the figure which had once belonged to Barbarian Niu standing on top of the wall. After watching it for a long while, Li Yunmu communicated with the system. System, if I could capture him alive, could God Undercurrent be expelled from the body? Theoretically it is possible. As long as host is willing to pay enough experience points, the system is capable of expelling God Undercurrent. However, the system recommends that host doesn't stay with this thought. God Undercurrent should have already erased Barbarian Niu's soul to preserve intactness and stability of his control. Even if you forcefully expel him from the body, host will only obtain an empty shell. The system spoke in the same pattern as always, one line definite reply followed by its analysis. From the time Li Yunmu had obtained the super shadow hack system, it appeared that everything was in its control, except what it didn't wish to inform Li Yunmu about or what he hadn't asked about. Otherwise, it was seemingly omnipotent. With a ray of hope in his heart, Li Yunmu inquired with the system, "Then what about Ling Shuang? Is her situation the same as Barbarian News?" This time, the seemingly omnipotent system turned silent. After roughly 2 breaths time had passed, it spoke slowly. According to the system's inspection, under the control of the secret technique unleashed by the enemy, Ling Shuang has completely changed into the enemy's most loyal servant. However, if host could capture her alive and would pay the required amount of experience points, the system could restore Ling Shuang to her original state. Capture her alive. Li Yunmu bitterly smiled while shaking his head and didn't continue the discussion with the system. Although he hadn't seen Ling Shuang after returning, God Undercurrent himself was standing atop the Impregnable pass wall. On top of that, behind Li Yunmu was a group of top powerhouses rushing forward with their battle intent rising to the skies. They were about to catch up to him. This was the decisive battle. In this battle, the powerhouses of Earth and God Undercurrent would decide who would become the hegemons of the 7th dimension. If God Undercurrent lost, even if he didn't perish, he most likely wouldn't have another opportunity to turn it around in the future. After the heavenly transformation, he would also become one of the small flies. Under the control of God Undercurrent's secret technique, Ling Shuang had completely turned into his most trusted and intimate existence. But when the situation of the decisive battle reached its climax, he definitely wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice her if it could give him a chance to attain victory. What would Li Yunmu do at that time? In order to rescue Ling Shuang, would he take on the fury of Battle Sage Vega, Battle God, and the others, enduring the attacks of all the powerhouses on the side of the allied forces? While massaging his glabella, Li Yunmu looked at the wall. God Undercurrent, I guess you didn't expect that we would meet so quickly? You left me with an enormous debt, so I must pay it back properly. Standing on the wall, God Undercurrent tilted his head and asked with a slight smile, "When did we meet? I don't understand what you are trying to say." Although there was a slight smile on his face, he was completely flabbergasted in his heart. He had no idea what sort of method Li Yunmu had used to expel his power from his body, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. He had believed that he hadn't left any tracks, and that like Battle Sage Vega, Li Yunmu would just suspect him. It should have only been a suspicion, however, something without proof behind it, so who could insist that he did it? What sort of tyrant would that person be? But at that moment, when God Undercurrent heard Li Yunmu's mocking tone, hesitation arose in his heart. Li Yunmu seemed to be certain that all the previous matters were his doing and hold no doubt about it, not suspecting any of the other powerhouses. The slight smile on Li Yunmu's face didn't change, and he didn't bother any more with his opponent. He slightly bent his legs, resembling a startled mantis, and dashed up. Before the Fluxer subordinates of God Undercurrent who were responsible for guarding the wall could even react, he stabilized himself on the wall. The checkpoint at that height was only useful for resisting dimensional beasts who weren't too intelligent. In front of a Fluxer with tyrannical strength, it existed only in name. Terrifying pressure. Once Li Yunmu landed on the wall, his expression changed slightly. Even without the system's monitoring, he could sense that his strength had dropped by close to 1/3. With the weakening of strength to this extent as well as the defensive weapons and soldier fluxers, it wasn't a wonder that the checkpoint which seemed completely unnecessary to Li Yunmu had surprisingly stopped Earth's allied forces for such a long time. It had even acquired many casualties. After Li Yunmu appeared on the stage, God Undercurrent wasn't anxious to attack and only waved his hand lightly. "Slaughter him," he commanded. Naturally, he wasn't anxious to attack himself because he could still sense the burning gaze on his body which belonged to the most powerful person on Earth, Battle God. If he attacked Li Yunmu, the leaders of the 5 transcending powers would rush forward to deal with him without any hesitation. The defensive weapons above the wall began to operate. They included all sorts of flux energy heavy bows, catapults, and other sorts of siege weapons used before the Dark Ages, as well as the flux cannon and other weapons developed by humans in the Dimensional Age. After being installed on the wall, almost all of them had been turned into tools for harvesting lives. With a slight thought, little Ching, who had been cultivating in the heavenly world, transformed into a cyan pike. Although the Impregnable Pass wasn't narrow, there were numerous fluxers fighting against Li Yunmei while sticking to each other. Although they were afraid of his strength at the beginning, allowing him to hold his ground, none of them dared to hold back after God Undercurrent's personal command. Several fluxers with sinister expression surrounded Li Yunmei. Even if they weren't willing to go forward, they were forced to do so because of all the people pushing them from behind it. Under this situation, sword-like blades would definitely not be able to unleash their full potential. Even if Li Yunmei possessed countless battle skills, it was impossible for him to use them just like that and behead everyone around him. Even if Battle God or the others were in his position with their strength suppressed, they also wouldn't be able to accomplish this feat. A flexible long spear was the perfect weapon for this type of situation. Even if Li Yunmei had forgotten almost all spear-related skills, he still remembered a few moves and only lacked the might of a battle skill. Chapter 569, Being Treated as an Abandoned Son. Get lost. With a furious howl, Li Yunmei took the initiative to go on the offensive. A green long spear nimbly entered and exited the empty spaces between the numerous fluxers, and its sharp tip left behind a pretty trail of blood. In a flash, 7 flux energy cultivating life forms with strength reaching Nirvana Flux Master Realm were slain. The cyan spear in Li Yunmei's hand continued to dance, shaking away more than 10 blade-type weapons trying to block its retreat. Back off, drop, penetrate, endure, push. These 5 moves were being used to the maximum. One after another, vivid life forms perished under Li Yunmei's hand. One after another, siege weapons were also crushed to pieces. For a short time, Li Yunmei was like a god of war going on a rampage with his unparalleled spear atop the wall. The suppression on flux energy because of the Impregnable Pass was terrifying. Fluxers which only relied on flux energy could only use their weak flux energy to protect their not-so-strong bodies or use the feeble power to launch an attack. Li Yunmei, however, didn't even need to use his Admiralty War to resist the attacks of the enemy. His physical body was more than sufficient. But his aim wasn't to clear the waves of trash soldiers, but to shield the Allied army. Therefore, he only cared about holding his ground while going on a rampage and releasing an unprecedented amount of power to destroy the siege weapons which only he could see from his position. As for the Allied army, color began to return to the deathly pale faces of many fluxers who had previously been blocked by the siege weapons. In close to 10 small-scale battles they had fought before, the defensive weapons had been the ones responsible for most of the casualties. Unless the enemy's siege weapons were completely annihilated, the conflict would not reach its end. Thus, the majority of the weaker fluxers had been prepared to perish. With Li Yunmei sharing the majority of the burden though, the pressure on them had lightened greatly. The situation was completely different from before. Back then, before touching the wall, nearly half of the attacking force had been wiped off. The remaining warriors were also completely exhausted. So in this situation, how could the Allied forces hope to achieve any kind of victory? The majority of fluxers of the Allied army who had participated in the sieges were wiped out. If the top powerhouses who were leading their followers, family, and sect disciples said their hearts did not ache, it would be a complete lie. But every time, the characters taking the lead in the battle were Vega Temple, War God Shrine, Blood-Ewood, and other transcending powers. The experts belonging to them never even knitted their brows. In every one of the battles, they were also the most active troops. When the situation was like this, the other powerhouses couldn't complain. Now, Li Yunmei alone was going on a killing spree along the wall. Although it was impossible for him to influence the whole battle with his strength alone, but compared to previous situations, the change was like the difference between heaven and earth. The many fluxers who were saved by Li Yunmei's actions began to feel thankful toward him in their hearts. God Undercurrent, who had been attentively watching Li Yunmyu go on a rampage, tightly clenched his fists. Although he was mentally prepared, it was still quite a blow to see Li Yunmyu open a path for the allied forces with his strength alone. As the army got closer to him, the situation became increasingly more perilous. "Damned little demon!" God Undercurrent furiously bellowed in his heart, but he still forcefully resisted his desire to act. Battle God, Li Yunmyu, Battle Sage Vega, and God Undercurrent were all powerhouses and knew perfectly well that the people who would determine the final outcome of the battle would definitely not be the soldiers, but the experts standing at the pinnacle. If God Undercurrent attacked Li Yunmyu and couldn't kill Li Yunmyu quickly or force him to retreat, he would definitely reveal a flaw. Right away, the supreme transcending experts who were calmly walking through the air would turn into ferocious beasts with only one goal in their minds: to tear him to shreds. God Undercurrent lightly shook his head and calmly commanded to Ling Shuang, standing by his side once more. "Use human lives to fill it." Even the physical strength was suppressed slightly on the Impregnable pass, so what needed to be said about the flux energy? If it wasn't completely suppressed, the enemy wouldn't have gone as far as to use all sorts of siege weapons to deal with the allied forces. In fact, even the flux energy weapons wouldn't be able to stop the powerful momentum of Earth's army. But they were in the 7th dimension. The fluxers who could survive here were definitely not weak. Yet, as previously stated, the outcome of the battle wouldn't be determined by ordinary fluxers, but rather the top experts. Without the special conditions offered by the Impregnable Pass, God Undercurrent wanting to battle against 5 battle sages by himself would just be a lunatic's dream. At their level, every bit of strength could be said to be a difference of heaven and earth. As long as God Undercurrent was above the Impregnable Pass, he had a certain amount of initiative when confronting the 5 supreme transcending experts. "Ask the people under your command to speed up the attack." Battle God shot an indifferent glance at Li Yunmyu and said in a deep voice, "Although Li Yunmyu's strength is tyrannical, he is still immortal. With a heavily injured body, he won't be able to last for long and will lose his combat strength. We can go passive then." Sword Sage was standing near Battle God. He had been looking ahead with a squint, but suddenly he calmly opened them, revealing the bright sword light flickering in them. "I will go and give that youngster a hand. You all keep monitoring God Undercurrent and don't allow him to fill the gap. Frontline God is already dead, we cannot afford another such loss." "No, don't." Before Battle God could even open his mouth, Battle Sage Vega rushed forward and even sealed the space around Sword Sage. After a moment, she clenched her teeth and said with hatred, "God Undercurrent is using numbers to deplete Li Yunmyu's strength. Wait until he believes that he can kill Li Yunmyu, only then shall we move. He is still holed up behind his defenses, and if you attack now, I fear that he will just choose to escape." Given the vastness of the 7th dimension if God Undercurrent managed to escape, he would absolutely cause a catastrophe in the future. Even though Li Yunmyu was Battle Sage Vega's representative and she had supported him before, her choice this time was obvious. Between Li Yunmyu and all the humans of Earth, this defender of Central Continent abandoned him without any hesitation, like she had done with Bestial Sage when she had ruthlessly attacked and killed him. Chapter 570, 2 Choices. The cyan long spear was dancing in a semicircle, sweeping away the fluxers in front of it. However, when Li Yunmyu looked around, even he couldn't help but feel helpless. The number of flux energy cultivating life forms concentrated here were enormous. Even if he had been in his peak state, let alone now, it would have been impossible for him to suppress the whole wall by himself. "Ha ha!" Li Yunmyu began to gasp. He stabbed the cyan long spear into the ground while narrowing his eyes slightly. By then, his whole body was washed in blood. Countless flux energy cultivating life forms had been ambushed, blown away, and crushed to death by him. They almost filled half of the wall with blood and corpses. Although Li Yunmyu had stopped his massacre, the baleful air coming from his body remained terrifying. The group of fluxers guarding the wall gradually stopped their advance. Dimensional beasts frequently pretended to be weak and heavily injured to lure humans or other dimensional beasts close to them. They would then explode with power and kill their target. When Ling Shuang received the command, she could not use God Undercurrent's words to relay it. Therefore, the soldiers only received the command to obstruct Li Yunmu from continuously destroying the defensive siege weapons on the Impregnable Pass so as to avoid the Allied forces from reaching them. Yet the crazy killer had stopped by himself, so who would dare to provoke him? God Undercurrent looked toward the 5 supreme experts standing in the air beyond the wall in contempt and loudly said, Li Yunmu, you can see for yourself the kind of people you are assisting. Don't tell me that you still cannot make out what they are waiting for? Even I can feel that joining hands with this sort of people is not worth it. Li Yunmu's hands clenched tightly around the spiral, and he once more began to walk toward God Undercurrent. Step by step, he got closer with a deadpan expression and a completely calm gaze. Boom! When God Undercurrent appeared in front of Li Yunmu, he exploded with an extremely terrifying presence. 2 pairs of indifferent pupils looked at each other, and Li Yunmu took the lead to open his mouth first. You made so many of your subordinates throw their lives only because you weren't certain that you could kill me in a blink of an eye. Since you finally appeared in front of me, do you finally have the confidence? Ha, ha ha, ha 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 ha. Hearing his words, God Undercurrent suddenly began to laugh madly. The 5 supreme experts standing beyond the wall felt a sense of crisis rise up. Before they could react though, God Undercurrent's presence rose sharply once more. It showed up that even if the 5 of them joined hands to suppress him, they still wouldn't be able to keep him in check. Have any of you ever thought about why I spent so much time and effort to create an impregnable pass capable of suppressing strength before you attacked me? Don't tell me that you truly believed that I was afraid of you? Regardless of how powerful you are still ordinary people. And I would be afraid of you 6. God Undercurrent's voice was filled with contempt. Even if Li Yunmu heard himself being considered as equal with the other battle sages, he felt quite unhappy. The history of human civilization is longer than you all imagine. Before Dark Ages, there was the age of science and technology. Before that, the humanity had once reached the peak, which was the true peak of the civilization. In that age, people possessed strength comparable to lower deities. Once he said that, a deranged expression appeared on God Undercurrent's face, and he sneered at them. What do you think of my 10-directional devil refining great spell? Speaking of which, I still have a favorable opinion of you all. If not for so many youngsters dying here, how would I have been able to restore my strength so easily? Humph! Li Yunmu sneered coldly, but there was no change in his expression. With a cold gaze, he rushed forward while collecting his strength. God Undercurrent's presence became increasingly more terrifying, reaching the peak of Battle Sage realm. He could now draw assistance from the energy and baleful aura gathered in the 10-directional devil refining spell to terrify people. If the Allied forces had truly retreated because of God Undercurrent's shout, then the next time, they would definitely not gather in the 7th dimension once more. After God Undercurrent regained his combat strength, him attacking and invading Earth would be an inevitable matter. A cold light blossomed at Sword Sage's waist. His blade wasn't long, only 3 foot in length. The tip of the sword was emitting dense cold air, which seemed to greatly lower the temperature of the surroundings. Clearly, his sword was an extraordinary weapon. Sword Sage tightly gripped the hilt of his sword and used flux energy to spread his voice. Everyone, we cannot retreat from today's battle. Either we break through this pass or we fall back and wait for God Undercurrent to come find us one by one. Forward is death and retreat is also death, so why should this old man care about living a few more days? Let's stake it all. When this old man came today, he didn't expect to return alive. But even if he dies, he must prevent that bastard from harming Earth. Old monster, why speak so much nonsense? If you want to attack, then attack. All of us have a brain in our heads, so you think we'd get scared to death? Following Sword Sage's words, the group of disciples from transcending powers agreed as if God Undercurrent wasn't worth a fart in their eyes. The people under some of the top powerhouses had started to think about retreating, but with the disciples from transcending powers rising up, an inexplicable heroic fire lit up their hearts. As long as even a single one of them was standing, God Undercurrent's side shouldn't even think about catching a breath. Good, good, good. God Undercurrent was furious enough to say good 3 times in one breath. You're all taking a quick road to your own destruction, so don't blame me. Hear me, the target is the Allied forces. Unleash all the defensive weapons without holding back and let them experience the difference in strength, he bellowed. Before he was even finished, God Undercurrent looked at Li Yunmu and grinned. Li Yunmu, I greatly admire you. Therefore, I will not kill you. Instead, I give you 2 choices, either you obediently become my subordinate and enjoy the glory, splendor, wealth, and rank in the future, or you give up your body to me and I will protect your close relatives and friends in the upcoming calamity. Since the start, God Undercurrent firmly believed that Li Yunmu's flesh was a physical body with the best endowments in the present age. Barbarian News speed of absorption of 10 directional devil refining spells energy was extremely slow. If he had Li Yunmu's body, his strength wouldn't have stopped advancing past the peak of Battle Sage realm. After rising in the air, Battle God suddenly issued a low-voiced order. We cannot allow this person to win. Even if his strength is suppressed right now, he is still stronger than me in my peak state. But perhaps the 5 of us when allied with Li Yunmu might have the strength to battle against him.